So let's go through an example here on the outcomes side of things. So these are made up, and to illustrate the point, let's start with the benefits column, who benefits. This is taking the basic structure we covered earlier about who benefits, what are the outcomes, and at what cost. So in the who benefits column, the board might state something like the organization should benefit low-income, disadvantaged people. Fairly broad, but it's clear what you're trying to achieve. The operational interpretation by the CEO might be something like 80% of the people we serve annually are Medicaid eligible. So that indicates that they're low income. Not everybody served as low income meets that test, but that's a good indicator or interpretation of the outcome. The evidence they might present on, say, an annual basis is that the annual average from the case management system shows that 83% are Medicaid eligible. So the conclusion is, okay, you're above the standard that has been set, and things are good, and you're good to go. So you accept the report. All of that is fine. If we now go to the benefits or outcomes or results column, people use different terms here. The board might state something like the people served should achieve improved mental health. An operational interpretation of that might be that we would like to see a 50% reduction in the annual hospitalizations for mental health reasons 1 year after entering the program. So you compare number of hospitalizations for a client before they come into the program, and then once they've been in the program for a year, what are the hospitalizations, number of hospitalizations. So that's practical. It's something that can be measured, and it is a good indicator of improved mental health. The evidence presented might be that, well, it was actually only 25% reduction in hospitalization, not the 50%. So the conclusion from the board reviewing that outcome data is that the full benefits weren't achieved. So the response might be request the CEO to prepare a plan to improve performance, to have them dig into, okay, why aren't we achieving 50%? What are some of the reasons here? And what are you planning to do to bring it up to the 50% level? I should mention here too a couple concepts on interpretation. One of the principles is that the interpretation is any reasonable interpretation. So the CEO is given, I think, pretty wide latitude within the broad board stated outcomes to come up with an operational interpretation. And you may also run into situations where when you get into measuring your outcome, you realize that your outcome was not stated as, didn't really represent what you intended, and there may need to be some policy changes. So to realize that there is that feedback loop that would naturally go on, and it's a very healthy communication between executive directors, CEOs, and the board. Then looking at the at what cost, the board might say improvement is achieved at less cost than the alternatives. The operational interpretation may be that the per person annual costs are less than the avoided hospitalization costs. So you're providing services, and it should cost less than what it would cost if the people didn't get services but were hospitalized more often. And then the evidence might be actual costs are 20% less than avoided hospital costs, outcomes met, and you're good to go. So let's look at this process now from an operational performance standpoint, again from the board's perspective. So this starts with establishing operational performance or operational conditions that are unacceptable. And as we mentioned before, that might certainly be illegal, unethical, too risky, and what you might consider, imprudent. And we're operating in very complex world these days, and more things that if an organization is not doing would be considered imprudent, like operating without a strategic plan, or having a diversity program, those sorts of things. And just with the same with the outcomes, the process of having a CEO interpretation of what those limitations are, review the performance, and have an appropriate response by the board. So some examples here on the operational requirements. So take the finance column as an example. The board might state that expenditure should not exceed revenue. The operational interpretation might be annual spending is equal to or less than revenues received, and no individual month will exceed revenue by more than 5%. So recognizing there's some fluctuation, but at the end of the year, things need to balance. The evidence on a, say, monthly report is monthly year-to-date spending is less than revenues. No month exceed the 5% limit. The organization's in compliance, and things are good. You accept the report. Treatment of staff, another operational condition that you may be very concerned about. The board might state that the CEO must not deviate from written personnel policies that clarify rules for staff, provide effective grievances, and protect against wrongful actions. So the operational interpretation may be that a comprehensive personnel manual meeting industry standards is available to all employees, and grievances are documented and responded to. Your evidence might be having the personnel committee inspect the personnel manual and look at the grievances to see if they are in fact being documented and responded to. So the report from the personnel committee to the board might be the the evidence is there in compliance, and you accept that. Another example would be compensation, where the board might state the CEO may not provide compensation that deviates materially from the geographic market for the skills employed. So you want to be a competitive employer, not out of range on the top side or the bottom side. So the operational interpretation may be a biennial compensation study shows no material deviation from the geographic market. So it's not something you're looking at, every year, but every 2 years. The evidence might be the study shows that certain jobs are significantly undercompensated and that the effective jobs show high turnover. In that situation, the board would conclude that you're not in full compliance, and you might ask the CEO for a plan for raising compensation for the effective jobs. Now I'd like to talk about how monitoring performance affects the board CEO relationship. And this is absolutely critical and is at the heart of the governance process. You should keep in mind the principle that the board really has one employee, and that's the CEO. And that you've delegated to the CEO or the executive director, whatever your title is, the responsibility for managing the organization. In this framework, the organizational and the CEO's performance are really one and the same. You can't have a poorly performing organization and a well-performing CEO. at least over the long run. Certainly there are turnaround situations where things are bad and the CEO is going to take a while to turn that around, but the performance ought to be headed in the right direction. The performance should be assessed against stated expectations. And this is the reason for writing the outcomes that you expect from the organization, being clear about any limitations or boundaries that you want adhered to. And these should be in writing. There shouldn't be the verbal understandings. And also the assessment should involve the entire board. In that, it's easy to say, oh, well, the chairman of the board will do the performance review for the CEO. Well, that may be what happens in terms of the meeting, but going into that, the chair of the board should have the backing of the entire board in terms of their assessment about how the CEO is performing, because they have been involved in all of the review of the monitoring reports and information. To have a very clear and honest discussion is important. This is an iterative process. You want formal responses to monitoring reports, so it's not just some nodding heads at a meeting that you say, okay, we like that report, it's fine, or we didn't, and here's what we'd like to see. If there's our action plans, then there needs to be some comeback where the CEO says, okay, here's the plan I laid out, and here's how I'm executing it, and the progress we're making. And we have a constructive dialogue. So the CEO's performance really is the board's judgment, aided by all this performance monitoring. So it's not necessarily a paint by numbers, and that, oh, you achieve this number, then things are fine. You have to apply some judgment here, but your judgment ought to have a solid, factual, documented base. We've been covering through this presentation primarily the board's role and the focus on outcomes or results, ends for the organization. I put this slide in here to provide a kind of a broader context about a lot of the measurement and monitoring that goes on in an organization and the various perspectives. So there's a lot going on here. I realize it's kind of busy, and we don't have time to get into all the details, but I think it's helpful to understand these different perspectives. The first is this logic model that we talked about earlier. I've labeled it here the value chain, but it's looking at input processes, outputs, and outcomes. And the focus that the board wants to have is on the outcome, or this the value delivered to the organization. And that's where we've been talking most of the time today. But there also is a what's often referred to as a balanced scorecard perspective, that the organization needs to be looking at its performance from both the customer and stakeholder perspective, its process, its financial, and its organizational capacity. And those four perspectives, these came from the for-profit world, but also now have been applied to the nonprofit world. So you may see some of these things as a board. It tends to be a little bit more something the CEO operates. But then, to keep in mind that your outcomes really are looking at the customer and stakeholder perspective and saying that's what we expect. So you're doing your job there. And then the financial process and organizational capacity often can get addressed by, from a board's level and board's perspective from your operational limitations, where you say, what's acceptable and what's not. The relationship between performance at the high level and at lower levels in the organization is very important, and something that CEOs, executive directors, are trying to achieve. So it's taking things at the high level and cascading them down to the department and to the program and to the individual level. This is hard to do, and it's challenging, and you don't see it very often carried out all the way, but it is something that does happen in some organizations, and it's a very positive thing when it does. It can be very powerful at providing that alignment. And then lastly, the perspective of linking goals and performance with strategies and with sometimes incentives, so that your performance measure, you can see how the performance measure affects the top level goal, the outcome you're trying to achieve. You've broken down the performance measure to a target and who's accountable for that, and the strategies and initiatives involved. So it's another set of linkages that an organization may be providing for their measures and the performance targets, linked with the strategies. So what can go wrong? Well, a lot can go wrong, but there are ways to solve a lot of these problems. As you're looking at monitoring performance and putting a focus on getting results, there certainly can be organizational resistance and fear. In some ways, it's only human. And there are a couple of ways of getting around it. One is to make sure that the results are really aligned with the mission, because most of the people in the organization are going to be committed to the mission. That's a big driver in people who work in nonprofit organizations. So if you can make sure that alignment is nice and tight, I think you can break down some of the resistance. Also, to create a climate where failure is rewarded. Now, you don't want to encourage failure, but you want to reward the admission of when things aren't working well and the learning that comes from that. And that was so well illustrated, I thought, with the Engineers Without Borders case example, where in order for them to get better, they had to admit they were making some mistakes and they needed to do a better job. So you want to make that a positive experience, not something that is punished. It's very likely that performance will not meet expectations. Boy, I would be just very surprised in an organization if you set the expectations and right away everything's being met. So the norm should be that you're not meeting expectations, and that shouldn't be something that is necessarily bad, because you're always trying to get better. So to be positive about it, to ask for analysis to determine what are the root causes, why aren't we performing the way we want, and to look at corrective action plans. This is a natural cycle. All organizations do it. It's ongoing, should be kind of standard practice. Another common problem that I've run into is the misinterpretation of performance data. That you will get a report and you won't have the context, you won't really understand what it means, or you'll think you understand what it means when it doesn't. Now, there's a lot that goes into this that we don't have time for, including understanding common cause versus special cause variation and that sort of thing. But asking for things like benchmarks from similar organizations, putting the standards for performance in the data reports and the graphs, measuring performance against past performance, and understanding how much error there is in the measurement system. Can often be the problems you're seeing are a problem of the measurement system, not the organization. Linking back to one of the problems we identified at the beginning of it's too expensive to do this. That can be a problem. And a number of potential solutions. One is to be able to accept good enough instead of perfect. It's easy when you set the goal to say, well, and you come up with an operational interpretation to say, well, boy, that's not exactly what we want. Well, ask, is it good enough? Is it going to help us get better? And often you can find things that are good enough. Start small and set priorities. It can be overwhelming when you first put this all together to try to start measuring things, and you don't want to just say, oh, well, it's too much and not do it. So pick some of the most important things, start small, and get started. And be creative. You can look at proxy measures. You can sample instead of doing a comprehensive review. You can do the measuring less frequently to cut down on the workload. Measuring is expensive, and I've been through it for a lot of my career, so I know firsthand. So you want to be very careful and be very effective on what you do measure, so you're not wasting resources. You can have some unintended consequences, and there are lots of case studies about this that you can find, but it's where you end up putting too much emphasis on one or a very small number of measures and rewarding performance too much without considering the consequences. Because if people know that you want something, they will try to make that number move, and sometimes you've got to make sure they're doing the right things as they do that, so you don't get off track. Sometimes measurement conflicts between funders, some regulators in some cases, and the board, that you may be looking at expecting some different measures. So in those cases, I suggest look for acceptable alignment. If there's something that in a funder or a accreditation body that this is what they look to measure performance and that's close enough, you might just adopt that. Lack of performance measurement expertise. This is a big issue, and especially on smaller organizations. So you don't have people around who are adept at measuring performance, adept at putting the charts and graphs together in a way that is understandable. And a couple potential solutions that is you can look to board expertise. That's one thing you might recruit for in a board member, is we want somebody who's got some performance measurement expertise to help us, to be a resource for us. You can look for academic resources if you happen to be in a place that has a college or university where there may be students who can do this as a project. And lastly, I almost hate to bring this up, you do have data system barriers. I've heard this a million times in my career. And of course, it's best to be able to build data access into your IT strategy and realizing you want to get information out of it easily. But sometimes you have to work around the data systems and work with the data that may not be perfect. Okay, to wrap things up, a couple things I'd like everyone to take away from our presentation here. We've said it many times, but it's really important to measure performance, especially results. And if you haven't defined that and you're not measuring it, then you're running this risk of spending your resources and maybe not having as much or impact as you think you're having. And there's more and more pressure on nonprofits to show results. So don't shy away from taking this on. The board has a special role in monitoring performance. And we spent a lot of the time here talking about the governance role and the monitoring performance in terms of results and some limitations on operations. So to keep in mind that is different from a lot of the performance monitoring and data collection that a CEO might need to do the day-to-day operations and run the organization. So there should be numbers and data and performance measured all the way through the organization, but some or maybe even most of that is not something the board needs to be looking into other than knowing perhaps that it is going on. The success factors that I see here is that you keep your monitoring purpose, you understand what it is, why are we doing this and what will we do as a result, that the approach is systematic and sustained. So it's not a burst of activity, you do it for a while and then it drops off. This takes some work to put in place, and its impact is really felt if it's sustained over time. We've dealt today with some of the practical problems, or at least tried to touch on those. There are practical problems. We need to acknowledge them, address them, and find ways around them, because there'll be a lot of roadblocks put up that we can't afford it, it's too complicated, we don't have the time, we can't figure out how to do it. And those are all often legitimate practical issues that the staff have to deal with. So you need to work around those. We've talked about some ways of doing that. And then lastly, there does need to be leadership both on the board side and the CEO side to make this happen. If the board's not interested and doesn't have at least a core group of people who are pushing and taking the initiative to get this done, and if the CEO does not want to have that sort of relationship, things can fall apart. So leadership is important here, both board and the CEO. So thank you for listening. I hope this has been helpful.